Thank you very much for all being here. So, as Mark says, I'll be speaking about religious identity. I will give you a synthesis of the economic view on religious identity, and then I'll present some new work toward the end, which is joint work with Michael Sachs, who is a former PhD student at UC Irvine and also very active in the IMBS, where we're based today. All throughout this, you'll see my huge intellectual debt to Larry Nakone. This will come screaming out. But here we are. Summer of Love, 1967. Haight-Ashbury. These are idealistic college kids from around the country, descend on this part of San Francisco, partly because the San Francisco Medical School is doing free LSD trials. So they just have to walk up the hill, okay, to get it. You can see part of that influence here. But moreover, what's happening is that a lot of interesting things are happening. People are cooking and providing free food to everyone in the park. There's free clothing bank, there's free medical services. They're producing all of these club goods. And by all accounts, people had a phenomenal time, right, 1967. Why is this the summer of love and not the summers of love? Okay? Well, by the end of the summer, 1967, this makes national news. And in 1968, when you see interviews with people who were there in 1967, everyone descends on Haight-Ashbury again, but now they're joined by all of these free riders from around the country. These people who have no ideological connection to the movement and are just there for the free food, free clothing, and free love. And they kick the hippies out of their squats, they take their food, they take their clothing, etc. And this movement collapses, lasts for 1 year. So this is a situation in which a social movement has to avoid this invasion of free riders. Otherwise, success begets failure. Okay? Religion is, first of all, ubiquitous, but religious organizations are some of the most stable organizations in human history. And so they are able to do this in various ways. And our fundamental understanding of how they're able to do this comes from Larry's work. So religious organizations have a club-like structure, and religious identity is based on club membership. Club membership is not a straightforward group in which people are just arbitrarily labeled greens and reds, for example. But membership itself involves certain costs, and they can be quite substantial costs. Costly requirements include stigmatizing forms of dress, speech, dietary, and sexual practices. These are not just totally unproductive costs, they have a strategic role. And so the first part of this talk will be devoted to the sometimes puzzling strategic functions of these costs of religious identity. The first is screening. When you impose certain entry costs, you screen out non-believers and non-cooperators from the group. So you're selecting a particularly conducive part of the population for group membership. The second is substitution. These stigmatizing requirements essentially act as a tax on outside activity and cause you to substitute outside activity for in-group activity. Okay? And all of this can solve the free rider problems associated with collective production in this group. And that's the basic source of the inefficiency. We're engaged in collective production, there are fundamental free rider problems involved, and these are second-best solutions to these. Religious groups have solved these in various ways, and they vary a lot. Okay? So there's a huge degree of diversity in terms of religious identity. So here are the first two strategic functions, which comes out of religious identity costs, which comes out of other work, of Larry's work, plus the work of others, including work by Amone, Iannacone, Makowski, and Rubin, which tests the model. And they find that these sacrifices, religious sacrifices, do play this productive role. They do increase welfare. And in particular, the screening function is particularly relevant. It's particularly important in terms of entry costs, or taxing outside activity really screens out the non-cooperators, okay, and changes the distribution of people that are selected into the group. based on my work, I propose 3 additional complementary strategic functions of religious identity costs. The first is what I call sorting. Okay, how is this different from screening? Sorting, these are economically neutral traits. So you have A's and B's in a population. They're not more cooperative. A's are not more cooperative than B's. They're not more productive in any way. They're just different. And you want to interact with individuals of your own type in a group. Okay? And that may not be possible without certain costs of entry, as we'll see. These various forms of costly religious identification also generates commitment to abiding by religious norms of behavior when you're outside the monitoring range of your community. Okay? We'll see examples of both of those. I won't spend much time on the latter because the paper that I'll go into full detail on will describe this in some detail. That is that religious identity makes possible the cultural transmission of religious traits with high fidelity. Let's start with sorting. Very brief description of 3 and 4, extremely cursory treatment of 5, and then we'll go on to a full-blown paper that tries to combine various things. Okay, sorting. This is based on a paper of mine. 2 unobservable, economically neutral types denoted by tau. Now, the way I interpret the Kandinsky-Clay experiments is not as a minimal group treatment. That doesn't change the interpretation of many studies, but I wouldn't call it a minimal group treatment. Because, you and I meet, we say, we have something deep in common. I can't put my finger on it, okay? But we have something deep, and I enjoy interacting with you. I have no observable way to know that beforehand, but once I interact with you, I think that we have something deep. Now, the Kandinsky-Clay experiments, though it may seem arbitrary, actually there are differences between those answers, and abstract expressionists are supposed to get to something deep, some deep personality traits, some deep aesthetic principles, and so it could be dividing people based on deep personality traits in this way, okay? And that's valuable to people, but we're not able to do it readily in society except through group formation, and certain groups may form to perform this matching function based on these unobservable deep personality characteristics, and that's what we're talking about here. Population of n players, type 1 is the minority. Each player joins one of 2 groups, and this is the payoff. They can contribute xi to club good production of the group, that is summed and then evenly divided amongst group members. That detracts from their private consumption. Plus, they have some own type bias, okay? So some alpha is the strength of this own type bias. This is the proportion of individuals in their group that are of their own type, which is unobservable. The key thing here is that the free rider problem gets worse with the group size. So if you have an exotic group, a group made up of exotic types that are rare in the population, they can sustain high levels of cooperation if they're just a group isolated by themselves. But what happens there is that other types want to join that group for the club goods that they're producing. But then that undermines the sorting. So how do you preserve sorting in the face of these free rider problems? Well, with free membership, you can sustain sorting. That's a perfect sorting equilibrium. That's just a subgame perfect equilibrium in which you get one type joining one group and the other type joining the other group, if alpha is sufficiently large. But you need a pretty high alpha, and that alpha bar goes up as the minority groups get smaller, more exotic. Okay, so really exotic groups, you may not be able to do this. But if you have some membership cost C, you are able to sustain it even for low alpha, because let's say you have a one type group, that's the minority group, the ones are willing to pay the cost, certain costs, but the twos may not, because the ones are interacting preferentially with their own. And so these membership costs sustain sorting, and these membership costs don't have to be type dependent. They're just a uniform membership cost that's able to do the job of sorting because you have a type dependent benefit here. This minimum membership cost, as we see, is strictly decreasing, is strictly decreasing in the share of the minority population. So, clubs for exotic types require greater membership costs. Rather, that should say, strictly decreasing. So, clubs for exotic types require greater membership costs. If you have a weird type of personality, you're forming a group around that, that's going to be a strict group. Okay? And you can think of these costs, one version of what these costs may mean in real life are weird belief systems. Why do some groups have weird belief systems? It could be because it is easier, one way of interpreting it is it's easier for the type 1s to entertain that belief system than it is for the type 2s. And that may generate sorting. It's not that we actually truly believe in it at some fundamental deep level, but it provides some sorting between deep personality types. Okay? Commitment to religious norms of behavior. This is different degrees of veiling that we see from left to right, becoming stricter. So this is based on a paper of mine in 2013. How do we think about veiling? I wrote this paper because I thought there was a lot of discussion about it, a lot of public policy being written about veiling, but very little understanding about even why women veiled. Why do we see a rise in veiling since the 70s and 80s? And what happens if we ban veiling? Okay? So here's my theory of veiling. Veiling is a commitment by adopting a veil, in the model it's a continuous degree of veiling. The more you veil, the more committed you are to abiding by religious norms of behavior, even when you're outside of the monitoring range of your community. And so then, this is not just a commitment, but it's also a public signal thereof. So women who are embedded in conservative communities, who face harsh judgments for interacting outside of the monitoring range of their community, can take up educational and labor market opportunities while still maintaining their esteem within the community by veiling, by taking on this commitment mechanism. And that's the role of religious identity here. Okay? It provides a kind of partial integration strategy which balances the desire for economic participation with the desire for community esteem. And in that sense, the interpretation is different to it being a retrogressive move, the rise in veiling. It is actually a form of partial integration. Now, if you ban veiling, under this view, you increase segregation. But more surprisingly, if you embed this in an intergenerational model of cultural transmission, you can actually increase religiosity in these communities, okay, by various means, which we can talk about if you have questions on that. And there is evidence, since my paper was published, that this is the case. Religious women exhibit higher rates of veiling when they are more exposed to modern influences, including having more non-Muslim friends. Okay? Now, religious identity works here, this commitment role of religious identity and its accompanying signaling function works based on differential stigma in two domains. Veiling as a partial integration strategy depends on stigma in the social domain but not the economic domain. Okay? You're integrating to try and take up work outside of the home, get educated in a city different to yours, etc. But the commitment relies on some social stigmatization. Okay? Why is there a commitment? Because you don't meet the same people if you're veiled. You can't go into a bar as you could without veiling. You just change your environment by veiling. That generates some kind of religious commitment. And that requires some level of social stigmatization in the social domain. So this partial integration strategy collapses if either discrimination emerges in the education or labor market, or veiling becomes totally normalized in the social domain. So religious identity works in a kind of, it depends on these various conditions, I think, how it works here. Cultural transmission of marginalized traits. Well, in a lot of the cultural transmission literature, we have Pete Richardson, who I started reading Boyd and Richardson, and this is how I got into it, and also Carvalho, Sforza, and Feldman. In some of the work in economics, at least, what we have is that the cultural transmission works either within the family or in society at large. You're randomly matched with someone of the society. Now, cultural transmission necessarily entails various externalities. You get a cultural trait from someone else that you may not want. It also entails free rider problems in the sense that you may acquire a trait that you want to acquire simply by interacting with people who have it without doing any of the work to produce it in the first place. And so it's natural that groups emerge to regulate this process of cultural transmission endogenously. And so this is the middle ground between the family and the society, this group formation. And religious groups do this. And so I've got some work on that, also with Mark Koyama and Michael Sachs. But let's go to, well, actually, let me sum all of this up. These different functions of religious identity, these strategic roles of various identity costs, can all be seen as examples of the theory of the second best. That is, inefficiencies due to imperfect monitoring, commitment, etc., produce compensating institutions. Now, these institutions can often seem bizarre and unproductive, however, and inefficient, but the various inefficiencies that are involved in the institutions compensate for underlying inefficiencies. And they can seem unproductive if you don't have proper ecological knowledge. So you have to understand really what's going on here. You have to understand each ecology. Like with veiling, you have to understand how it's different. What the view of veiling that I spoke about is this kind of new veiling movement, which you see in Egypt, in Turkey, in UK, USA, etc. But it may be very different to what's going on in Iran and Saudi Arabia. So you need some proper ecological knowledge there that's tailored to the inefficiencies and peculiarities of the particular context. Yes?
So just one comment on this point that veiling might be a different response. It could be a sign of rebellion, for example, or a sign of conformity, depending on the society that you are dealing with. So if you are in a conservative society, and veiling would be like conformism in many ways, but in Western society is actually often a sign of rebellion, maybe.
That's right. So the way there is a conformist, in the model there's a conformist element, right? Because you're judged by people around you, your actions, your expected actions. Now people can't perfectly monitor you if you're outside of the monitoring range of the community, but they're inferring from the environment that you're interacting how you're behaving. Now veiling, and they're evaluating your actions based on their preferences. So if you're in a more conservative community, you want to commit yourself to religious behavior, and that's why you veil. So there is a social influence component to the model. But in terms of the rebellion, the way that's not explicitly in here, but where you see that is that if you're interacting in a more tempting environment that tempts you to violate religious prohibitions, then you really need this. So it's a combination of the social influence plus the dissonance between the environment and the community that you're interacting with there. There is a rebellion component. You can think of an anti-conformist component to veiling, and that depends on the environment too. I agree with that. That's not there. Okay. Questions? Okay, with that said, of thinking about the specific ecology in which religious organizations take root, let's look at a more general model, a general model which disregards that to some degree, but actually we think will provide some principles that can be then tailor-made to different environments. So here's a recent model, The Economics of Religious Communities, which is joint work with Michael Sachs. The subtitle to this is Social Integration, Discrimination, and Radicalization. Here, when you think about a religious community, there are two types of identity. You're born into the community, that's community membership, okay? That's given. You're born into that community. Then you choose whether or not to become actively religious, that is to participate in a religious organization or religious club within that community. And so we have two different types of identity there, and that will correspond to two different types of discrimination that we'll see later on. You have blanket discrimination against all community members, and you can have conditional discrimination against only actively religious members. So what we're interested in is how the strictness, the social and economic integration of a religious community, the cohesion, is determined by the outside options of the community and the internal organizational principles of that community. One application of this is to Jewish communities in 19th century Europe in the wake of Jewish emancipation, work that Mark Koyama and myself have done. But this model builds on that work. We want to understand what is the effect of discrimination against community members and what type of discrimination, right? Do they go in different directions? Does religious competition raise religious participation? We try to contribute to an age-old debate. It starts between Hume and Adam Smith, David Hume and Adam Smith. And can forward-looking religious leaders radicalize the community over time? If so, what factors constrain extremism? To answer these questions, we need a lot of features that are missing from existing models. We need heterogeneity, okay? Low commitment and high commitment types. Okay, so low religiosity, high religiosity types in terms of preferences. We need a well-defined exit option. What happens if you don't participate in a club in the community and you kind of assimilate? Okay, what do you get out of that? We think that positive network externalities are important here. This is inherent in the notion of a religious movement, that the more people join, the more you want to join, so increasing returns to membership. Religious competition, we need to introduce that and to compare that to a situation in which there's a religious monopolist that serves the whole community without the threat of entry from other religious entrepreneurs. We'll compare the two. And finally, we embed this in a dynamic framework with fully forward-looking religious leaders and look at dynamic radicalization strategies in these communities. Okay. Community consists of a large but finite set of agents, n, cardinality small n. Nature assigns types. With probability p, you're a low type with a parameter theta L. Probability 1 minus p, you're a high type rather with parameter theta H. With complementary probability, you're a low type with parameter theta L. We'll see what those parameters mean in a moment. Once types are realized, these types are private knowledge, but p is known, the distribution is known. Religious organizations then announce a minimum participation requirement. We're going to start with the religious monopolist, okay, and then build up to competition in a moment. So the one religious organization here announces a strictness level. What is that strictness level? It's a minimum participation requirement. You have to be part of the club, devote at least proportion S of your time to in-group activity, to club goods production. Observing S, individuals simultaneously choose a division of their time between outside activity and religious participation. Xi is the amount you devote to club production. If Xi is greater than or equal to S, then you're a member of the club. Otherwise, you don't get access to the club. A religious club good is then collectively produced, payoffs received. These are the payoffs. Your payoff from outside, this is the proportion of time you spend in the club, so this is the proportion of time you spend outside of the club, okay? That's outside activity. For each unit of time you spend outside of the club, you get pi. You can think of that as a wage, for example, for outside work, or you could think about that as a return to social activity outside of the club. There is a club good component which is non-rival, where this is J's contribution to the club. It is a weighted average, this is a weighted sum of all of the club members' contributions. Theta I is the value you place on the club good that's produced here, and that's if you're low commitment, you have a lower value than if you're a high commitment time. What are these omegas? These omegas just play a technical role so that while together individuals produce the club good, no individual produces a large fraction of the club good, yeah, when n is large. Okay, that's if Xi is greater than or equal to S, you're admitted to the club and you get both sources of payoffs. This is from religious participation, that's from the club goods production. This is from outside activity. If this is not the case, then you're excluded from the club, and what do you get? In the standard literature, you get pi, which is just this with Xi equals 0. But we have a form of, when you're a member of the club or not a member of the club, that's a difference in identity, and that may mean a difference in payoffs depending on discrimination. So you could, we generalize this so that you could receive a payoff of delta pi, where delta could be greater than 1. In other words, you can think of delta as a form of conditional discrimination. If you're actively religious and a member of the club, you get a lower payoff from outside activity if you're in the club than when you're outside the club for delta greater than 1. Okay? The religious leader, what does the religious leader do? The religious leader maximizes total religious participation. There are this is a big debate in the economics of religion as to what the religious leader maximizes, whether they maximize members' welfare, whether they maximize number of members. Well, the number of members is in here plus the intensity of participation. When we have competition, religious leaders are going to be pushed toward maximizing members' welfare, but endogenously. Okay? Religious equilibrium of the entire game is a strategy profile which implements a coalition-proof Nash equilibrium for each level of strictness, and the strictness chosen by the leader maximizes the leader's payoff. So we're taking into account coalitional deviations here. Okay, this makes things easier in some sense, harder in others. Clubs are formed not typically based on the Nash calculation of individual unilateral deviations, but by groups of individuals moving and starting new clubs. They collapse and they grow and they unify, etc. in this way, and we want to take that into account. That's why we look at coalitional deviations. Now, in our case of a religious monopolist, the religious monopolist will push participants in maximizing total religious participation as far as they can push them, right to the participation constraint binds. And if they want to maintain an inclusive club, that is to form a club within the community of all community members, including low and high commitment types, this is how they can push them depending on the level of conditional discrimination, delta. If they want to maintain an exclusive club, this is how far they can push them. Okay? You don't need to know too much about this. I'll demonstrate this graphically in a moment. There are a lot of propositions. There are 10 propositions in this paper. I'm just going to show you some figures, really. And you can illustrate everything, just about everything that goes on here. Now, this is an exclusive club composed only of high commitment types. In a lot of the literature, it's just simply assumed that you exclude low commitment types. But when you have positive network externalities, you may want to keep them in. Under some conditions, however, you want to raise strictness, induce low commitment types to exit, and cater only to high commitment types at a higher level of strictness. And that screening emerges endogenously here. It's not assumed under certain conditions. And we can show under what conditions you want to maintain an inclusive club versus an exclusive club and screen out low commitment types. So this is what the equilibrium structure looks like in terms of P, the proportion of high commitment types in the community, and delta, the proportion of the level of which is the attractiveness of outside options, or the level of conditional discrimination. They're interpreted in the same way. Okay, so here we are. Let's say P is low. Okay, so we're here. This is the proportion of high commitment types is low. What you have here, depending on the attractiveness of outside options, either you have a cohesive community where everyone joins the club, or you have complete assimilation where everyone leaves. As outside options get more attractive, people just leave the club. As the proportion of high commitment types goes above this level here, then we have three different regimes as we increase delta. We start with a cohesive regime where everyone joins the club, to an exclusive regime where the high commitment types only the high commitment types are members of the club and the low commitment types exit, to complete assimilation. Here we see this boundary here is where this endogenous screening occurs. You can possibly get a cohesive community here. You can attract all types to form an inclusive club. However, it doesn't benefit you to do so if you're maximizing religious participation. It's better to raise strictness, let the low types exit, and cater only to the high types at a high level of strictness. Total religious participation is S lower bar because you just want to keep the low types in, okay, until you get to a threshold level of extremists or high commitment types, and after that, the total religious participation in the community scales superlinearly with the proportion of high commitment types. You can think of the extremists in the community. So wherever, even in the competition case, the growing share of high commitment types fragments this community. Okay? Discrimination. We can think about Muslim communities in this context. Muslim communities in Europe exhibit lower levels of social and economic integration than other migrant groups. And one possible explanation for this is social and economic discrimination. And David Layton and co-authors do a very interesting job in teasing this out. its excellent work, which is recently presented at ASREC, we can think of two different types of discrimination. Remember, this is conditional discrimination. If you're a member of the club, the higher this is, the lower your payoff is from being a member of the club relative to being a non-member of the club. Pi is the payoff to outside activity that's common between club members and non-club members. That's just if you're a community member, you get pi as your payoff from outside activity. So the reciprocal of that you can think of as blanket discrimination. That is, you're lowering the payoff from outside activity for all members of the community, regardless of whether they're a club member or not a club member. Okay? So those are two different measures of discrimination. You can do in different ways. This is the most compact way to do it, but you can do it in other ways and get the same results. Social integration is the average time community members spend outside of the community, which is this. This is the interesting region in which you have endogenous screening. In this region, social integration is decreasing in blanket discrimination and increasing in conditional discrimination. Blanket discrimination reduces the opportunity cost of religious participation. Okay? And so it increases, 10 minutes, so that it increases your religious participation and decreases your social integration. Conditional discrimination, however, increases the cost of religious participation and therefore lowers your religious participation and increases your social integration. This, however, neglects or it hides certain non-monotonicities here, because social integration is a function of how many people are, what proportion of the community is a member of the club and the strictness of the club. And so once you disentangle the two, there are non-monotonicities in strictness in terms of the two deltas, as we'll see. This is the less interesting case of blanket discrimination. When blanket discrimination is low, you can't, and that means that pi is high, the returns to outside activity are high, you can't maintain a group. There's complete assimilation. As it grows, you can maintain an exclusive group. Eventually, you can bring everyone into a cohesive club, and in the limit, you can maintain a cohesive club at full strictness, where people are devoting all of their time to in-group activity. This is the more interesting one, conditional discrimination. When conditional discrimination is low, you can maintain a fully cohesive club at full strictness. As conditional discrimination increases, you have to liberalize to keep the low types in the club. But as you have to keep liberalizing, it eventually becomes prohibitively costly to continue to do so. And what you do is you just raise strictness, induce the low types to exit, and just cater to the high types. And so even though conditional discrimination increases social integration on the whole, it can lead to this non-monotonicity in strictness and generate this strict, isolated group as a result of an increase in conditional discrimination. And according to Berman and Layton's work, for example, these are groups that we may be concerned about because they have this close-knit, tight club structure, and they have a high capacity for collective action, including violence, terrorism, etc., when you have these strict, small, isolated groups. Okay, religious competition. Now a set of K organizations who compete for members. This is how things change. Let's focus on one set of conditions. The new thing here is you have a schismatic equilibrium where you have a less strict club and a very strict club emerging, but only in part of the space here. And it emerges where there's a high proportion of high types. It's the high types, as they grow, they split the club always, whether they induce assimilation by the low types or whether they assume they induce the low types to form a new group, separate group. They're always driving the fragmentation of this community. When the outside options are not very attractive, the low types form a low strictness group. When outside options are sufficiently attractive, the low types just assimilate, and we don't get schism, we get exclusion. Okay. We can compare monopoly to competition. Social integration is greater under competition. Okay? This is not the standard result in the economics of religion, but it's driven here by something quite simple, that under competition, the strictest choices of religious entrepreneurs are tied to the preferences of individuals, including when you have this coalitional deviations. So they can attract, they can attract, if you're not maximizing or approximately maximizing members' welfare, another entrepreneur is going to come in and take your group. But a religious monopolist can, because they're maximizing total religious participation, can push their members further than they otherwise may want to. And so that means that they can increase religious participation relative to the competitive environment. Let's look at the dynamic extension. Time is discrete. Religious leaders are long-lived. Community members are short-lived. Okay? So they maximize the discounted sum of religious participation over time. We can express this as a Markov property, so we can express this in terms of a Bellman equation. Let's look at the cultural transmission of religious preferences to start. Before we assumed P was fixed, a constant. But now let's assume that it evolves with religious participation in prior periods. So in particular, we can define this. This is the community-wide average level of participation, F of P. This is just the average participation amongst club members, actively religious members. That's F tilde P of P. The religious preferences in the next period are going to be a weighted average of the community average and the club average. When alpha is large, or alpha is non-zero, that means that the extremists or the high commitment types within the club have a disproportionate influence on cultural transmission. Okay? Now, let me just illustrate what goes on here. If you start at this level of P, what happens is an inclusive club forms, and immediately you go to this level of this proportion of high commitment types. If alpha equals 0, that is just the community average level of participation determines religious preferences in the next period, you remain at B forever. But if alpha is greater than 0, you may move to C. What you're doing there is you're taking a short-term hit in terms of religious participation by forming an exclusive club. You have less religious participation today. But what you do is you form a group, a high strictness group composed of the extremists, and you use those extremists to build up religious preferences in the community over time. And so not only do the more members of the community become high commitment, but also the strictness that that exclusive group can demand increases as that happens. And so you get a transition to D. And so this is a kind of radicalization strategy over time. How long do I have? 3 minutes. Okay. This radicalization strategy depends on several things. Forward-looking leaders, disproportionate exposure for extremists. Alpha has to be sufficiently high, mu has to be sufficiently high. And religious monopoly. It cannot happen under religious competition, in this model at least. Okay? We can adjust this for competition dynamics. The stage game outcomes are the same as in the one-shot game because religious members are short-lived. And so the religious leader doesn't have these dynamic strategies at their disposal because their strategy is pinned down by the short-term preferences of each generation. If they decide to do some dynamic strategy, they're going to lose everyone today, right? Because some religious entrepreneur is going to come in and take them. And so you can have complex transition dynamics and all kinds of things which we analyze, but basically this rules out radicalization. Competition rules out radicalization. This is a different take on a debate between Hume and Smith as to whether competition really reduces religious violence or raises it. Endogenous discrimination. I won't go through the results here, but let me just basically describe it to you. What happens if we take blanket discrimination and make it also a function of prior religious participation in the same way as before, just with the lambda around the front? What happens now is that there's a new dynamic strategy here, and you can think of it in terms of niche construction. If you can the religious leader can raise strictness, that induces blanket discrimination against the group, but that subsidizes religious participation within the group because it destroys your outside options for community members. And so they can do this systematically over time and generate a fully cohesive, maximally strict community by simply engendering blanket discrimination against themselves. Okay? This only happens, of course, if the society responds to high religious strictness with blanket discrimination rather than conditional discrimination. If it's conditional discrimination, this doesn't happen. But if it's blanket discrimination, this does. There's an interesting quote by David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, when he was Secretary of Defense, right? And where he says that the greatest, to paraphrase, the greatest fuel for terrorism is blanket discrimination. So this is the notion of blanket discrimination generating much stricter groups, and this is a kind of a positive feedback process in which this can go much further than you may think. This is only possible when conditional discrimination is low. Okay, let me sum up. Religious participation scales superlinearly with the share of extremists once a critical mass is reached. A rising share of extremists fractures the religious community. Blanket and conditional discrimination have different effects, but both can produce some form of extremism. A religious monopolist can use extremist members to radicalize the community over time, and they may also engage in various niche construction strategies where they try to isolate their community from outside pressures, and by cultivating blanket discrimination against the community. Religious competition rules out such radicalization strategies. So this is the basic insight from this work. Okay, questions?
So I don't get the assumption that religious leaders live much longer than members. It seems like
it's not that there's a physical leader. Okay, leader may be the wrong. There's an organization with dynastic preferences, with a long-term preferences, like the Catholic Church, for example, which has
cast of leaders that have a separate channel of social transmission of information. Would that be the right interpretation?
And they share some identification over time, so they act as if they're a single person with discounted preferences. That's the idea. So, for example, in parts of the developed world, if you want to endow a charity, you may want to do it through a religious organization because you're less likely to get, trust is less likely to get expropriated because you have these kind of long-term preferences that are built in through some common identification. That's the idea. Yes?
So I'm still trying to wrap my mind around various institutions, but one that struck me as at least somewhat counterintuitive is this idea that you need that forward-looking thinkers
Yes.
can produce these equilibria that are more strict. I don't even know if they're equilibria, but they're increasingly strict.
Yeah, they are dynamic equilibria. You get to a steady state in the proportion of types and the various state variables eventually, but they are dynamic equilibria, yes.
But that it requires no intergroup competition because presumably like people just leave the groups that are increasingly strict, right? But I guess I can imagine that there would be intergroup. So presumably the increasingly strict groups are realizing higher payoffs along with kind of number by participation, multiplicative outcome, right? And if that were being selected for in the intergroup competitive dynamic, or the numbers were, for example, like if it were just that like larger groups were being selected for in the intergroup competitive dynamic, then you could get at least the opposite results without having to expect the forward thinking.
Well,
Requiring the forward thinking assumption of the leaders.
I see. Yes, we don't have that kind of competition. We have competition for members, but we don't have competition over some scarce resources in the community. And if you're talking about that, then there may be some other benefits, strategic benefits to extremism, and so those groups may win out in that sense without forward looking. That's right. There would be an evolutionary dynamic which would lead to this escalation over time. But we don't have that competition over resources. Exactly. It's a religious entrepreneurs come in and try to take parts of the community for themselves. Yeah. Questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.